Marhaba and welcome to Free Palestine Pod, the podcast. I'm Lama Bazzari.
And I'm Lina Hadi. Each week, we will bring you in-depth commentary from Palestine.
Let's talk Palestine. Today on the show, we welcome Peter Beinart, liberal columnist, journalist, and political commentator, and former editor of The New Republic. Peter has authored 3 books and is currently editor-at-large at Jewish Currents and a professor of journalism and political science at Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism and Political Science. He also writes the Beinart Notebook on Substack, a free newsletter. There's a link to it in the show notes. Marhaba, Peter. Welcome to Free Palestine Pod. Let's talk Palestine.
Great.
Can you take us, Peter, through your first visit to the occupied West Bank, and how did this visit shift your views on the occupation?
My first visit was about 20 years ago. I was already an adult. I was in my early 30s. Like a large, significant number of American Jews, I had been to Israel quite a few times. I've been going there since I was a child. We had relatives there. My father had done work there. You know, like many American Jews, my experience with Palestinians had been very limited. So I think in a vague sense, I understood that what Israel was doing in the West Bank was problematic to me. That's very, very different than actually having a firsthand experience of kind of seeing what the lives are like for people who've lived their entire life without any basic rights vis-a-vis the state that controls their lives. And I think it's kind of one thing to kind of, even if you understand that in the abstract, it's one thing, but to actually kind of see what life is like for people who've lived their entire lives under the control of a government that is completely unaccountable to them and is accountable to their Jewish neighbors who are settlers and therefore can abuse them kind of at will, whether it's taking their land or imprisoning them or even killing them, denying them water, denying them free movement, making them wait endlessly at checkpoints, an endless kind of number of indignities. I realized then that I really needed to kind of start to think differently about how I was going to reconcile my sense of kind of obligation and sense of connection to my fellow Jews with the kind of moral obligation to oppose something that I not just now kind of didn't just know in some vague abstract sense was kind of fundamentally wrong, but that I had actually seen it up close. And I think, especially being the child of South Africans who had spent a fair amount of time in South Africa in my youth, the way in which people, including people that I was close to and people that I loved and people that I knew were good people, had the ability to rationalize things, come up with excuses for things that when you saw them up close were simply completely immoral, was something that really began to bother me and something I realized I needed to kind of find a way of thinking through.
And just a question, how did you end up taking a tour? Was it you had scheduled it on your own, or was it through one of the Israeli NGOs, like similar to?
It was actually through an American think tank. I'm not even sure Breaking the Silence was actually yet in operation back then. This would have been 2000, maybe 2002. It was funny. The trip was actually, a lot of the trip was just spent in Israel. It wasn't necessarily, the think tank that I went with was not particularly even progressive. It's just that we spent, I think, a single day in the West Bank. I think one of the people I remember meeting was Diana Boutou, who was, I think then, I don't know if she was still then an advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team, but I remember meeting her and a couple of other Palestinian activists. And I've noticed this again and again, and this is one of the things that maybe gives me some small degree of hope, is that I have noticed again and again that when people from the United States go and have a genuine encounter with Palestinians, even inside the Green Line, but especially obviously in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, even if those people have been very, very steeped for their entire lives in a narrative which basically says that Israel is a thriving liberal democracy and the Palestinians are to blame for whatever suffering they've experienced, that gets destabilized actually quite quickly, in my experience, by actual experiences on the ground. And then the challenge is to kind of, what do you do with that kind of recognition, and for me, it was a long process that continues to this day, but of trying to learn and read and develop relationships with people who can provide a perspective on understanding of things that I just was not exposed to growing up.
Seeing is believing. Do you see that more Jewish Americans are considering to pay a visit or learn more about the occupation?
I think so. There's one. So you mentioned Breaking the Silence, which has taken a lot of people. There's another American Jewish group called Encounter, which I think is doing some very interesting work. Encounter really tries to take prominent American Jews, many of them from very establishment pro-Israel organizations, but many of them do have this kind of sense that maybe they haven't gotten the full story, or maybe it's just the allure of seeing something different. And many of those people do come back deeply shaken by the experience. Then the challenge is, for what do they do about it? Because oftentimes they are working within institutions and they live within communities where actually speaking honestly about those things could put their jobs at risk, could make them very, very unpopular. And so it's not always clear that those folks know how to organize in such a way to try to change the politics of the Jewish community. And then the other, I think, positive thing is that you don't, even for folks who can't go there, I think that, Edward Said famously talked about the Palestinian lack of permission to narrate. And while it's still the case in the American media that Palestinian voices are very marginalized, I think they are less marginalized than they were 5 years ago, or even 2 or 3 years ago. I think that the Black Lives Matter movement and the Me Too movement have created more of a self-consciousness about questions of representation in the mainstream media, which creates a little bit more of an embarrassment than there was a few years ago about always having conversations about Palestinians that didn't include Palestinians. I noticed this 2 years ago during the fighting, when there were more Palestinian voices. I think there are more Palestinian voices than there used to be. Not enough, but more on the kind of op-ed pages of America's best newspapers today. And there's also, I think, there's simply more Palestinians in the United States and other Arab Americans who might have an experience. And I think that this, if you listen to American Jewish organizations, the impression you would get was that American Jewish kids go to college and then they are assaulted by all of these pro-Palestinian and Palestinian activists who, make their lives miserable. And there are some Jewish kids who experience it that way. They experience pro-Palestinian activism as extremely threatening to them, given that they've come to college with this kind of Disneyfied vision of Israel. But there are many, many others who actually interact with Palestinian kids and hear about those experiences and are very affected by those things and have the ability to listen. And it affects their journey and their thinking about this. So there's no question that there's a generational shift among American Jews. Whether that will be enough to change America's policies of essentially unconditional support for Israel, that's a different question. But there's no question that there is a generational change going on.
But then you have birthright, where it also, unfortunately, completely erases and whitewashes the occupation.
Yes, right. And so birthright was really created as a response to the fear that young American Jews were not as connected to Israel. And also the idea was that by taking young American Jews to Israel, you could connect them to Judaism, that they would feel, and sometimes that does happen. And look, I don't think there's anything wrong whatsoever with young American Jews feeling a deeper attachment to Judaism. But as you say, the problem is that you're getting a fundamentally dishonest view of what Israel-Palestine is. More than half the people under the control of the Israeli government are Palestinians. And so if you go and you have no interactions with them, but you're constantly being told that they're this menacing group of people that you can't visit because it's too dangerous, that produces racism and kind of dehumanization. So it's true that birthright has been had some effect, I think. But even birthright, it's interesting. There's a small group which has been created called Extend, and created by young American Jews. And what they do is they say, okay, if birthright is going to send you to go to Israel, and they're not going to take you to interact with any Palestinians, why don't you stay a few more days? And they take some of these kids into the West Bank to actually see the kind of things that they're not being told. So I think there is a desire for these things. And even despite the kind of efforts that the American Jewish establishment organizations have made to kind of create a kind of a cocoon in which young American Jews can grow up and then live their whole lives kind of essentially insulated from Palestinians, I actually think that more people are challenging and breaking out of that.
One thing that is almost scary is that you were raised primarily, you said you were raised in the United States. Your parents are actually South African, and you didn't have your awakening until your early 30s, and you're in Manhattan, right? I mean, you're in New York. I'm, from the same generation, and I'm from the capital of the United States, and I was definitely one of those people that was in charge of the Palestinian group on campus and on many campuses. And I'm surprised that you hadn't interacted with Palestinians before that. We actually have not increased in the United States. We have to hide our identity. What Edward Said, who I also studied under, what he said was that we weren't even allowed to be Palestinian. I mean, wasn't even allowed to apply to any schools or even manifest my Palestinianness. My mother, who was born in Palestine, her own passport, U.S. passport, says she was born nowhere because they don't recognize the state of Palestine. So it's interesting. But on further to that,
you're right. I think the point that I was trying to make was not that you're right. It was not that the percentage number of Palestinians have increased, but I do think that one thing that's happened is I had a conversation with Rashid Khalidi many years ago, who talked about the impact of having a generation of Palestinians born in the United States, who he was arguing would be more effective advocates in American politics because they were American born. I remember he said to me, this was many years ago when we had lunch, he said, we have to produce our generation of lawyers, by which he meant people who were not immigrants, but people. And I think you see the fruits of that now, perhaps more than you did a few years ago. And that's part of what I think has made Palestinian solidarity become so seamlessly a part of left-wing activist circles on college campuses and others. But you're right. I mean, it was not that these things were not possible to learn about, I should say the funny thing is I considered even when I was a teenager and in my 20s, I thought of myself as someone who supported two states, who thought settlements were wrong. I didn't think of myself as someone on the right at all, but I thought that Israel should allow the creation of a Palestinian state. But even that was a discourse that was really framed, didn't grapple, I would say, with some of the deeper questions, which was, how is it possible to actually have a country that is based on Jewish privilege and Jewish supremacy, even if it's only within the 1967 borders? What about the rights of Palestinian refugees? What about the rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel? What about coming to terms with the Nakba? Those were things, it's true, that it took me a very, very long time, I think, to really start to engage with. And I think that probably, if I think back on it, those things would have been extremely threatening, because for me, like many American Jews, I was raised to think about Jewish statehood as the primary guarantee. A state in which Jews had essentially uncontested power was the primary guarantee against another act of massive persecution of Jews. And that was just something that was considered so obvious in the world in which I grew up. My grandmother used to tell me all the time, Jews have no other country but Israel where they can truly be safe. And so that was for me something that it took many, many decades to actually to question that.
Well, I'm glad you questioned it, and I'm glad that you're advocating for the Palestinians and that you understand that, in fact, it really has nothing to do with Judaism. I feel like they were hijacked by the Zionists and by the state of Israel. I don't see I understand the need for a safe haven for everyone, especially Jews, given the horrid persecution that they underwent for a few centuries. I mean, I'm well aware of that, but I feel like they're completely two different subjects and have nothing to do with the Palestinians, who we ourselves were in fact Jewish at one point and Christian, and some even went on to be Muslims. I mean, it's just, there's a big difference. But on that note, I would love to get your opinion on Israeli entertainment, and in particular Fauda, which is a very popular Netflix series and very, very controversial, as you are well aware. But I would love to hear your thoughts on Fauda.
For my newsletter, I interview someone every Friday. And actually, the last Friday, I interviewed Saeed Kashua, who's been actually very involved in the Israeli entertainment industry, created a number of shows. And I specifically wanted to ask him about Fauda, and actually came across an essay that he had written in Haaretz in 2018, which was titled something like, "Let Us All Hate Fauda." So I wasn't surprised to hear his perspective. And I think some of the people who watch Fauda, and maybe the creators of Fauda, have convinced themselves that it's a liberal show because it shows, Palestinian suffering, or it shows that Palestinian, mothers are bereft when their children are killed or something like that, right? But that just shows how absurdly low the bar is. And it also, I think, first of all, it presents this image of the kind of Israelis as superheroes, right? That like they can infiltrate any Palestinian area, and they're Arab, because every Palestinian I've ever asked about this just finds the idea completely laughable. But I also think that it presents this as through the narrative of a conflict, right? There are these two sides, they're fighting one another. The Israeli side is they're stronger, right? So they ended up kind of winning. But I think that the narrative of this as a conflict misses the fundamental point, which is that, yes, there's violence, including violence from Palestinians, but fundamentally what it is a very powerful state holding millions of people under its, subjugating them without basic rights. And so if you think about it within that framework, it would be kind of like some shoot up, action thing in which on the one hand you had the African National Congress, and on the other hand you had the government of South Africa, or on the one hand you had the United States government, and on the other hand you had the Black Panthers or something like this, right? None of us seeing this would recognize that as an acceptable moral framework for a situation in which the fundamental core reality is the reality of domination and oppression. And I think that's what Fauda basically kind of ignores and
is quite dangerous for the American media, who we know are already so misled when it comes to the question of Palestine. And so I feel like, yes, there's a little bit of normalization of Palestinians, but actually it's quite vicious, and it's heavy, it's a lot of misinformation. It's David and Goliath kind of reversed again. Mm-hmm. But I find it very, very disconcerting. And also, I was wondering your opinions on the relationship between Hollywood and the Department of Defense, which is also very disconcerting, that they happen to actually advise Hollywood on, many of the let's say anti-Arab sentiment, anti-Palestinian, all the wars that they create in Hollywood, and they're using the same arms. Well, there's just a lot of collaboration with them, and with inevitably the IDF, or the IOF as we like to call them. How do you feel about that? It's just American media is.
Honestly, I can't say that that's a subject that I know very much about. I'm not very knowledgeable about Hollywood in general. It wouldn't surprise me that there might be those interactions, but I can't really say that I know much about it.
Okay. Well, yeah. It all plays in the same field. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on it. Just wanted to get your opinion on Fauda, and I'm glad that we share a similar opinion.
You wrote previously in Jewish Currents, Jewish right of return should also apply to the Palestinians. If Palestinians have no right of return, then neither do we. And as you're aware, that's a right that Israel continues to deny millions of Palestinians since 1948. Can you elaborate on the context of your statement when you made it?
Sure. So this was an essay that I wrote a couple of years ago called tshuva. Tshuva in Hebrew means repentance, or it's usually interpreted as meaning repentance, but it actually means return. So it kind of means the idea of a kind of moral return. And so I was using it, of course, because it, to play on the idea of the necessity of a physical return, but also seeing that right of physical return for Palestinians as a kind of moral or spiritual return of Jews to traditions, I think, of humanity and empathy that have been lost to some degree. The point that I was making was not that, the Jewish memory, what Jews call Eretz Yisrael, land of Israel, that was sustained over these 2,000 years and cultivated, and then ultimately was part of the reason for the creation of the Zionist movement, is not that is the same as a Palestinian who was driven out of Haifa or Jaffa or Tzfat or wherever in 1948, or their children. They're, in obvious ways, they're very, very fundamentally different. But I was trying to use the Jewish understanding of memory of home and of how precious that is and the way it's cultivated to try to help Jews understand how absurd it is and insulting it is that we would tell Palestinians to simply get over this experience and create a new life in Jordan or Lebanon or Canada or wherever, right? That we know through one of the things that I try, there are many ways of advocating for Palestinian freedom and for equality and justice. But one of the things that I try to do in my work is speak to a Jewish audience in particular kind of language that I think might resonate with a Jewish audience. And sometimes in my experience, language is purely about universal human rights, while extremely valid. I mean, I passionately believe in those things. Sometimes in and of themselves are less effective than actually trying to use our own tradition, because our own tradition is so often deployed in ways that end up becoming the justification for the denial of Palestinian rights. It's our land, et cetera, to actually our tradition is very vast and broad and includes many different voices. And to try to elevate those voices in our tradition that actually can be vehicles for us to actually come to understand that it is not that supporting Palestinian freedom, and in this case, supporting the Palestinian right of return and recognizing the Nakba and recognizing that there needs to be historical justice, does not mean that we renounce ourselves. Doesn't mean that it means that we become a better version of ourselves, that it's not an un-Jewish act. It's actually a way of connecting to, I think, a more ethical kind of Jewish tradition that's been lost. And so it's for that reason that I was trying to use the pride that Jews feel in this way in which we have never forgotten this idea of Eretz Yisrael, to say that we of all people have no right to tell Palestinians that they do not have the right to return to a place in which they were much, much more recently than we were. And then to go on to try to argue that this notion that a Palestinian right of return would mean Jewish genocide or Jewish expulsion is wrong, that there are people who have actually thought seriously, Badil, Zochrot, various different other, Salman Abu Sita, who have actually thought concretely about what this would look like. And that the irony is that when Israelis or diaspora Jews say, well, it would be logistically impossible to give large numbers of Palestinians the right to return to their homes or what were their homes, since tragically we know that most of those homes and villages were destroyed. Actually, when Israel has had the possibility of incorporating large numbers of Jews who've come in very short periods of time, as it did in the early years of the state, and then again when a lot of Soviet Jews came, actually the state didn't see this as impossible. It saw it as a great challenge and actually did and was able to build a lot of housing very fast and figure out, if you recognize the moral necessity of this, then I think the practical issues are actually much more manageable than I think people want to acknowledge, people in the Jewish community want to acknowledge.
One of the key points you mentioned is recognizing the Nakba that was committed against hundreds of thousands of Palestinians.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple points. First of all, I think that what actually happened during the Nakba is not very well known in popular American and popular American Jewish discourse, or for that matter, Israeli Jewish discourse. I mean, you still have people who recycle these myths that people left voluntarily, and even people who kind of will acknowledge that Palestinians didn't leave voluntarily, have this narrative that basically, well, what was Israel supposed to do because the Arab armies invaded? Like basic recognition, for instance, that many hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were expelled before May 14th, 1948, before the Arab armies even attacked, and that there was the notion of Jewish statehood would have been impossible without an act of mass expulsion because there were simply too many Palestinians there. It was this. People often say, well, the Zionists accepted the partition and the Palestinians rejected it. Well, there was no way that the Zionist movement was going to accept, was actually going to, the Jewish territory, because Jews only were about 1/3 of the population and were given 55% of the land, had almost 50% of Palestinians in the Jewish territory that was created in the partition. So there was no way in which David Ben-Gurion was going to have a Jewish state in which had a 50% Palestinian population. The idea, I mean, many of the people, the Jewish figures that I identify with, people like Judah Magnus, Martin Buber, Hannah Arendt, the reason they opposed partition was they could see that partition would lead to a Nakba. They didn't have that word, but they could see that the partition would lead to an act of mass expulsion, which is why they opposed partition. So I agree with all of that. I mean, I think one reason that when I talk about this territory, I use the term Israel-Palestine or Palestine-Israel, not just Palestine, is that because for me, it is today a binational territory. There are two peoples with national identities. And so when I think about the future that I would like, I think about equality under the law for everybody with no legal privileges for any group, but a recognition that there is a desire for self-determination, for autonomy among both of these peoples. And there are countries like Belgium and others that have Canada that have a binational character and yet have equality under the law.
The reality is the Israelis are moving more to the right. Fascism has become mainstream.
That's true. Although it's funny, when people say that Israel's moving to the right, I sometimes think they're confusing different things. It's definitely a government that is much more explicitly religious than the previous governments. But the Nakba was perpetrated by secular labor Zionists. Palestinian citizens of Israel were held under military law between 1948 and 1966 by secular labor Zionists. The settlement movement was begun under the Labor Party government, right? There was another act of mass expulsion in 1967, long before, and so I don't necessarily, when people say it's moving to the right, I'm not necessarily sure what they're comparing it to. I mean, even Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir have not done anything nearly as brutal, right? They've not dispossessed nearly as many people as David Ben-Gurion did, right? So I don't necessarily see it as a move to the right as much as the reproduction, I would say, of certain core dynamics that have been there in the way Israel has treated Palestinians since the very beginning, which was essentially you want as few Palestinians as possible, and you want to concentrate them into as small a territory as possible, with Jews controlling as much of the land as possible. And I think that seems to me a kind of more continuity. Sometimes people think when people use this phrase, Israel is moving so far to the right, it becomes a way of whitewashing a little bit or suggesting there was this kind of liberal kind of Israeli politics that existed before because the people were not wearing kippot and because they claimed to be socialists or something like that.
I agree. But at a certain point with the Rabin era, you did have a larger segment of society who were more to the left, who did believe in the two-state solution.
Yes, I think that in retrospect, the Rabin moment was this very brief moment. It's a little bit like the moment of Reconstruction in the United States after the Civil War, where there was a brief potential moment and then a very fierce backlash against it. And it didn't come out of nowhere, right? I mean, it came out of the First Intifada. The First Intifada showed Israelis that the cost of controlling Palestinians in the occupied territories was much higher than they had thought it would be. And so they started to look for alternatives, right? We don't really know whether Yitzhak Rabin really would have moved towards supporting a genuinely sovereign Palestinian state. I mean, he had not by the time he was assassinated. Maybe he would have gotten there. When Ehud Barak, as you know, when the Labor Party came back into power, Ehud Barak, the offer that he made was not a genuinely sovereign state that would have been genuinely viable. And so I think on the one hand, a lot of Israeli leaders were looking for a subcontractor, which is ultimately what Oslo ended up producing, a way to control the West Bank indirectly at lower cost. But it's also possible that there was a moment in Israel during the Rabin period, and I think what was critical was the fact that the Palestinian political parties were de facto members of Rabin's coalition, and there was potentially the emergence, I think, of a political force that could have brought Israeli Jews and Palestinian citizens of Israel together in support of genuinely ending the occupation, and then hopefully moving towards genuinely democratizing Israel itself. And I think that's the movement that I would hope would emerge. I actually, in some ways, think it's, in a perverse way, it's kind of a good thing that Meretz, which is the most liberal Zionist party, didn't make it into the Knesset, because I think the most hopeful future that I would see would be that essentially Meretz would be absorbed into a movement that would be a Jewish Palestinian movement for equality. And so essentially, you could have a kind of like a joint list, or you could, Hadash, Balad, but also expanded to include more Jews under that umbrella, as more Jews realize that the notion of separation and partition needs to be replaced with a notion of freedom and equality in all the territory. And maybe at its best moments during the Rabin period, there was a little bit of a vision of potentially that.
But then the Israelis took him out.
One particular.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but don't tell me that he was. I don't think he was acting just on his own volition. But
no. I don't think he was. I mean, there was a whole culture of incitement against Rabin.
Yeah.
I don't think it was the Israeli state, but I think that there were powerful religious extremist elements that, as you say, that wanted to destroy him because they saw him as a threat. Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
They are now the players. Yeah. I mean, that is extremely disconcerting.
That's true. Itamar Ben-Gvir, although he wasn't actually considered to be part of the assassination plot, was very, very much in that circle of people who were threatening.
I think as an attorney, when you're representing them, you somehow are aiding and abetting somehow. He doesn't have a good track record when it comes to representing radical, fascist, Jewish supremacists. Israelis.
That's certainly true.
Unfortunately. Yeah.
Yes.
As scary as that is. There was one thing I wanted to circle back when you were discussing the right of return. And that was whether or not you have actually added in your research all of the Belarusians and all the people from the former Soviet Union who took refuge in Israel. Hundreds and thousands, apparently, who took refuge in Israel, and many of them were, in fact, not Jewish because, and I know many of them firsthand myself, because they then moved on to Europe. But, and many of them live in Nazareth and have actually married Palestinians because they were actually Christian and never even Jewish. I mean, I would say that if anything, with the Aliyah, Israel seems to have more of a problem trying to get people to come to Israel, aside from these extremist Jewish supremacists coming out of the juvenile delinquent system in the United States. We have quite a few of those, but yeah, quite a few. I mean, I think it's not that easy to call for an Aliyah. I mean, I don't see the attachment to Israel that for the Palestinians, for example, have to Palestine, Israel.
So it's true that you have not had a large-scale aliyah to Israel from among Jewish populations that were living in first world conditions. It's tended to be Jewish populations and that oftentimes there have been, when offered options, many Jews have instead gone elsewhere, right? I mean, there's a debate about the Jews in the displaced persons camps after the Holocaust. There were very, very strong Zionist kind of movements in those displaced persons camps. But it's also the case that America's doors, even after World War II, were not open to Jews. In fact, there was a bill in Congress to allow in America was more actually willing to let in non-Jewish displaced persons after World War II, even though some of them had been Nazi collaborators, than it was to allow in Jews, because Jews were considered to be more likely to be communists. Now, on the other hand, I disagree with you that the people who are coming, the religious people who are coming and making Aliyah are not juvenile delinquents, but they're not mostly juvenile delinquents. They're people who have a strong religious attachment to living in Israel, Palestine, because they're deeply immersed in a set of Jewish texts which emphasize the value of doing that. And oftentimes, what you find in the modern Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox worlds is that many of those people already have relatives living in Israel. So they already have a stronger connection. Now, I agree that the brand of politics is often profoundly racist, and produces terrible, terrible things. In terms of people coming from the Soviet Union, I mean, what I would like would be a country that provided absolute equality, that gave all Palestinians and their descendants, refugees, the right to return, and then had a policy towards immigration in general, right, which said that we want to have a liberal asylum policy, a liberal policy for refugees, and as a binational state, which represents both, that has two peoples within it, any Jew who is in distress and any Palestinian who's in distress would go to the front of the line, right? I don't believe there needs to be a law of return for Jews where any Jew around the world can just go to Israel, Palestine and become a citizen of day one. But I would like there to be a reality in which if there were Jews who were in danger, for instance, as Jews were in Ethiopia in the 1980s, that they would go to the front of the line in terms of being granted asylum and being able to become citizens. Part of the weirdness of the law of return now, and you were alluding to this, is the definition of who is a Jew is not the definition under Jewish law in which your mother needs to be Jewish. It was taken, essentially, they said, well, if Hitler said that you needed one grandparent to be Jewish, then that's kind of good enough for us. And then, as you're saying, there were people in the former Soviet Union who just wanted to get out of the former Soviet Union, right, who then were able to take advantage of this and come to Israel, and some of them didn't even have a Jewish grandparent. Maybe they had married someone or whatever. But again, to me, it speaks to the profound inequity in the system itself.
Absolutely. Rabbi Rosen, I was recently asking him about anti-Semitism, and he defined it as such. He said, today, being Palestinian makes you anti-Semitic. Just our existence makes us anti-Semitic. And as we know, IHRA has gone so far as to say that any criticism of Israel makes you anti-Semitic. So we're in a situation today where people like myself and Lema, we're Palestinian, and people then immediately just perceive us as being anti-Semitic when we are anything but anti-Semitic, especially we are Semitic, by the way. Right. And then you have the IHRA definition, which we're not allowed to criticize Israel, or we're anti-Semitic as well, which is also, by the way, very much the rule in Central Europe, where I live. And this is very difficult and beyond challenging. I mean, they've put us in a box and we can't get out. How would you advise us to address this?
First of all, the term anti-Semitism is a terrible term, right? It emerged in 19th century Germany, which had all kinds of Orientalist ideas, right? We should just call it, Jew hatred or bigotry against Jews, right? Because unfortunately, the term is so ingrained so when I use the term, I do it without the dash. It's increasing, right? Anti-Semitism, as if to say this term has nothing to do with the word Semite, right? Because as you say, that leads you into all kinds of absurdities. To be fair, the IHRA, which I profoundly oppose and have written about, doesn't say that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. What it says is that calling Israel a racist state or opposing Jewish self-determination, i.e. opposing a Jewish supremacist state, is anti-Semitic, and comparing Israel's behaviors to the Nazis constitutes anti-Semitism. That's a little bit narrower than all criticism, but it's still profoundly problematic, right? Because first of all, as all Palestinians, essentially, virtually all Palestinians, will want to have equality They won't want to live in a state that gives Jews more rights than them. Even if they are the minority of Palestinians who are lucky enough to have Israeli citizenship, they will want to be equal citizens, not second-class citizens. Why would they want to be second-class citizens? I wouldn't want to be living in a Christian state. I wouldn't want to be living in a Muslim or Hindu state. I would want to be living in a state that treated everyone equally, irrespective of their religion and ethnicity and race. Palestinians naturally want the same thing. So I agree with Brant Rosen that unless you're someone like Mansour Abbas, who somehow manages to say that he has no problem with a Jewish state, whether he really believes that or not, I don't know. But if he really believes that, I think he's a very, very, very small minority. Most Palestinians will want to be treated equally. And if you want to be treated equally, it means you oppose a Jewish state. And if you oppose a Jewish state, then that is one of the examples of anti-Semitism under IHRA. So I think that tragically, the struggle against anti-Semitism, which should be embedded in a larger struggle against bigotries of all kinds, including anti-Palestinianism, a term that we don't even really have in the United States because bigotry against Palestinians is so normalized that it's simply invisible. It doesn't even have its own word, even though if it did have its own word, virtually everybody in Congress, with a small number of exceptions, would be guilty of it because they're all comfortable with Palestinians having fewer rights than Jews, that this struggle against anti-Semitism, instead of being part of a broader struggle against bigotry and racism in all its forms, has become a way to try to shield Israel. And I think it's not a coincidence that it's emerged now, because it is as it becomes more and more obvious that there will not be a separate Palestinian state, it becomes more and more clear that people who believe in liberal democracy need to support one equal state. And therefore, it can't be a Jewish state. And so it's to prevent that move towards that becoming more mainstream in the United States and Europe that you need to say that that is anti-Semitic, right? And I think that's why the IHRA, why Israel and Jewish groups have been pushing the IHRA so much in recent years.
I mean, that coupled, with we also have the fact that they passed the nation state law in 2018. And so all you have to do is read the nation state law. They put it in black and white, in corners of a document, and it preaches Jewish supremacy. So when I say we can't criticize the state of Israel, this is exactly what I'm referring to. I'm referring to their actual laws.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
so.
No, that's exactly right. Israel is not, the Israeli defenders of Israel don't use the term Jewish supremacy, but in fact, they're very open about the fact that they see the idea of a state for all its citizens as something that they fundamentally oppose, right? That they want this to be a state that is essentially owned by Jews, right? And in which Palestinians are either non-citizens or essentially guest citizens who are not true owners of the state.
I'd like to circle back to the US. Progressives, except for Palestine, how can we shift this double standard that is prevalent in progressive circles and counter groups such as Democrats for Israel that has infiltrated the Democratic Party and is bankrolling very staunch pro-Israeli candidates?
So there has been, as we were talking about, there's been some shift in American media and in American popular culture, and there's been a shift in public opinion among Democrats in particular, and especially among younger Democrats. The problem is that public opinion doesn't translate naturally into policy, right? If it did, America would have had gun control many years ago. Most Americans want gun control, but there are forces that block it, right? And so in a campaign finance system where you can spend unlimited amounts of money, in which pro-Israel organizations are very well organized and well funded, they can block public opinion from translating, especially because the question of Palestinian rights is not one of the top issues for most American voters, right? They may believe in Palestinian rights, but it's not an issue that directly affects them, like their lack of health care or climate change or whatever, gun control. So it's not that hard for a liberal democratic politician to be progressive except Palestine, because that's not one of the things that people are voting on when they go to the polls, especially in an environment when Israel-Palestine is not a front burner issue in the United States. I think what we saw 2 years ago during the brief period in which this became a front page issue was it shook the American political system a little bit. I think there is a possibility for a shift in the United States. But what I think it will take is Palestinian resistance, because only Palestinian resistance puts this issue on the American front page. But also, and I think particularly I'm thinking about the analogy of the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s, Palestinian political leadership is not offering a vision that can speak to Americans, American progressives and European progressives, and laying out this vision and saying, we, in the way that the African National Congress did, we will fiercely resist oppression and we will accept nothing less than full equality. And we see a place for you in a future equal state. Our vision is not Algeria, right? We're not hoping that you go back to Poland. We are hoping that you live with us under conditions of equality and freedom, and our liberation will ultimately be your liberation. And I think that was the combination that the South African movement spoke that resonated so powerfully around the world. And so Mahmoud Abbas is not saying that. Ayman Odeh speaks that way.
I agree on your point on the resistance, but Mahmoud Abbas and the whole PA is a subcontractor to Israel. So
Absolutely.
They don't really speak on behalf of the resistance or the Palestinian people.
You're 100% right. I totally agree with you. I mean, they're, if to use the South African example, they're much more like Gatsha Buthelezi, who ran the Inkatha homeland, than they are like the African National Congress. But it is precisely because they're collaborators, they're corrupt and authoritarian, which is connected to their being collaborators, that they they're not offering a moral vision of freedom and equality. If there were some more people like that, then I think it would galvanize people in the United States. And I think that there's an interaction between what happens among Palestinian leadership and then what happens among people who need to be kind of mobilized to build the political force in the United States that could overcome AIPAC and Democratic Majority for Israel. And that's what I don't think we have right now.
And you also see the double standard in progressives, except for Palestine, in mainstream media. So what is your opinion on countering that?
Yes, that's certainly the case. Although I think there is a shift. I think that there are more of the people who are now defending, if you look at the people who now defend Israel in mainstream media, more of them are just conservatives. They're people who are on the right politically. The number of people who have credibility in liberal circles in the media who still essentially unconditionally defend Israel, there are fewer of those people. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of politicians like that, but there are not as many people in the media. And I think in the media, we are seeing a shift. It just hasn't translated into Congress and into Washington. And the Biden administration has been, I don't need to tell you, has been whatever forces there might have been in the Democratic Party that were shifting, Joe Biden was the worst possible person just about that the Democrats could have elected, because he is completely stuck in a mindset of decades and decades ago, and in which you basically just don't challenge AIPAC and Israel no matter what.
That's again the no criticism of Israel, and the no recognition of the Palestinians or of Palestine. What is also extremely disconcerting to the Palestinians are the Christian Zionists, and as you know, Zionism itself is Christian. And the increase of Christian Zionism.
Not only Christian. I mean, Zionists. There were Christian Zionists and Jewish Zionists.
There were Christian and Jewish Zionists, but it was there are questions as to who actually founded Zionism. But I believe that we can have another discussion about that. But the Christian Zionists have been and will always be very strong, starting with Arthur Balfour and that whole crew. But in the United States, we're seeing a huge rise in Christian Zionism, and partially, I believe, is due to Biden, who so openly holds himself out as a Zionist in the public, and clearly isn't aware of the definition of Zionism according to the United Nations. But what can we do about all these Christian Zionists who are popping up all over the United States, and all these reborn and renewed Christianity and embracing Zionism and supporting actually the state of Israel in effect. How are you addressing this? How do we address this?
I think that what Israel represents, I mean, there's a theological element, but I also think that a very powerful element is that Israel represents a kind of model for what a lot of people on the right in the United States would like America to be. And I think this is true in Europe as well. A lot of people in Europe see Israel as a kind of model. Israel calls itself a Jewish and democratic state. What it really means is that Jews are, the state is owned by one ethno-religious group, and everybody else are kind of guests and have to be on their best behavior. And I think that is the way that a lot of Donald Trump supporters would like America to be. America would be a white Christian nation, and we need to maintain a strong white Christian demographic majority, right? Just as Israel does through its immigration policy and other things. And everybody else needs to know their place, and be on their best behavior, or else they could get kicked out, or they could get very harsh treatment. And I think that the people like Marine Le Pen or Viktor Orban or the Law and Justice Party in Poland or the AfD in Germany, they see Israel as a model for the kind of country they would like, especially because they see Israel as very economically and technologically dynamic. So they say we can have an ethno-state that's really economically productive and successful and militarily powerful. And so the struggle against that has to be part of there is a global struggle around the world between the principle of equality under the law, irrespective of your race, religion, sex, ethnicity, and the idea that countries are owned by one dominant tribe. And I think that one of the things that bothers me so much about the way in which many American establishment groups defend Israel is in the United States, those people want equality under the law. They fear a white Christian ethno-state. They know it wouldn't be good for Jews, just like it wouldn't be good for Muslims and all other kind of people. But they want to make an exception for Israel because they say, well, we need to make an exception because there was the Holocaust and we're a very small number of people. But the truth is the exception, not to mention that it's obviously a nightmare for Palestinians, the exception doesn't stay in Israel. Israel has become a model for all of these movements from Bolsonaro. Look at what Modi is doing in India. He's trying to turn India from a secular state into a Hindu nationalist state, right? With all of the horrors that means for Muslims in India. And he's very inspired by the Israeli model. And so I think that part of what we need to do is just make the case that if you believe in the idea of equality under the law, you have to believe in it everywhere. You can't make exceptions for particular countries because this is a global struggle we're in. And if we lose, the consequences are horrific for huge numbers of people all over the world.
Well, thank you. And I look forward to following you and to following your path and hopefully being able to spread the good word to everyone, not just the Jewish Americans, but everyone in the United States.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be on the podcast with you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us this week on Free Palestine Pod. Subscribe, like, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter.
And be sure to come back next week for a new episode of Free Palestine Pod. Let's talk Palestine.